The amount of evidence pointing to conspiracy in these 60s assassinations, especially the two Kennedy brothers and MLK and Malcolm X, it's enormous, really. And I think the resistance to it is just that the implications are so grave that people just don't want to believe them. If they're regular people, or if you're an official or a media person, that it does not help your career to point to crimes that delegitimize the regime that we live under, because the oligarchy, which owns everything, benefits from this regime. And so it just doesn't behoove you to expose huge crimes of the state, which would delegitimize it.
What do you think might come out of the files? Because, given Trump's close relationship
Okay.
with Israel,
Yeah.
I mean, what really are they gonna leak?
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like, you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am here with Aaron Good, author of American Exception, Empire in the Deep State, a very good book that I recommend. And I had Aaron on almost about a year ago now to talk about that particular book. It was an episode on the deep state. I don't think we were on camera then, because I was still doing my podcast mostly not on camera at that time. And we had a very good discussion. And I want to hear your insights on some things that have been happening in recent geopolitics and with the Trump administration, because, for those who have listened to that episode, if you haven't already, I encourage you to do so. You have studied the question of the deep state in a lot of depth. And of course, you've studied Peter Dale Scott, who is probably arguably the most sophisticated scholar on this subject. So I want to get some of your insights on some of the things that have been happening, particularly Trump's very popular proposal, which he has recently signed, to declassify the JFK and MLK files, which is pretty big promise. And before we get into your exact analysis of that, would you like to just anything I missed in the introduction? Want to plug your podcast?
No, I mean, yeah, we're doing a lot of work still to podcast, and we're on YouTube with Devil's Chess Club, but some of those are, only partially on YouTube, and the rest with the full episodes on at the Patreon. But yeah, American Exception podcast at Patreon is where people can find me. And we're currently we have two series that are ongoing. One of them is on my collaborator, Max Arbo. He has a series on Jack Ruby, a series of articles on Jack Ruby that he published over at Kennedy's and King. And this really, I think, radically, or not radically, but pretty drastically changes our understanding of Ruby and establishes that the CIA, MK Ultra side of the CIA, was involved in Ruby's legal defense very early on and was likely calling the shots for how they proceeded with insanity defenses that they used, which were very ludicrous, but which would have served to discredit Ruby as a witness because, he's already arguing he's insane to the court, among other things. So that's a 4-part series that we've got. And then there's an even bigger project, a podcast series called Gray Alliance, which seeks to pretty drastically revise our understanding of the deep state and a lot of these events of the post-Cold War era, deep events, and brings in things that Peter Dale Scott illuminated, but didn't really totally flesh out. And Peter is in a class by himself. And in terms of doing all this research, and Deep Politics and the Death of JFK points to an organized crime element of our political regime that deserves a lot more exploration and investigation, and is, I believe, intertwined with Israel and Mossad, as well as the commanding heights of the FBI, Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and the CIA darkest bowels of the counterintelligence and Office of Security. Basically, we have been very mobbed up since the end of World War II, and Meyer Lansky and Mossad are a part of this story, which isn't to say that Israel killed JFK, because I don't believe that's the case, but they were a part of it, and they likely use it to blackmail the U.S. in several cases since then. So we're doing a lot of work on the podcast that really expands on my book, and probably this material, I would release it as a book, and I would write a separate book if I had, institutional support of the university and they could give me a sabbatical. But since I don't, and since I wanted to get this material out, I decided I would do it this way on the podcast. So I'm excited these days to talk about that material because it's so relevant to what we're doing. And it shows how relevant the JFK case is, and, these other unsolved political crimes of the U.S. empire, the JFK assassination, Robert Kennedy assassination, Martin Luther King assassination, 9/11. And perhaps the thread but that links all of them is the relationship between the national security state and the narcotics traffic, organized crime in the U.S. and around the world.
You just threw a lot there. And if those who haven't listened to that previous episode or explored the question of the deep state in general, they're probably immediately wanting to click off. They're like, this is a bunch of quackery. What is this? And I mean, I don't think it's necessary to really rehash what the deep state is. I mean, I think quite simply we can say that the deep state is the branch of the government that is unelected and can act independently from the elected government. And that's probably the bigger deal, because every government has an administrative state, but it's not always necessarily completely unbound, can act in violation of the elected government. Like,
You can veto the democratic politics.
yeah. And straight up, I mean, conspire against it. And
Yes. I mean, if they can assassinate the head of state, then the head of state is not really the head of state. Then we have a different kind of a regime. In that sense, the deep state is really like the political science idea of a regime. But we like to say that we have a democratic regime type, but we really don't. We don't know precisely what kind of regime we do live under, because sovereignty is exercised by a force and a political formation, an entity, or a nexus that we don't understand and can only try to piece together. It's sort of like the way scientists would try to look at the fossil record and speak about things that happened, 50 million years ago. We are left to try to grapple with the nature of the regime we actually live under, but we know enough to know it's lawless and very secretive and bent on global dominance, because we know enough of the policy papers and the actions of the United States to understand that. So the key thing that should be clear to everyone is this U.S. project since the end of World War II has been about ruling the world on behalf of Western capital to enrich a class of super powerful, wealthy oligarchs. And they created the CIA and other institutions to break whatever laws they need to secretly when they can get away with it, in order to maintain this empire, which supports this oligarchy of corporate wealth, fabulous, outrageous levels of corporate wealth.
And of course, the CIA was created by Wall Street. I mean, in part.
Yes, they were the driving force behind it. And they were the driving force behind the decision to go for empire in the first place. These Wall Street funded think tank people at the Council on Foreign Relations were tasked by the Roosevelt White House to plan for U.S. entry into World War II and the post-war peace. And they decided, hey, we're going to be in a great position. We could actually go for global empire, and then it'll be an empire of freedom. And they didn't even use the word empire as much. They said, it'll be an American century, and we'll be the leaders of the free world. But that's free world for them is code for free enterprise, which is another way of saying corporate, private ownership of capital and corporate dominance, private capital dominance of the political economy.
Yeah, I mean, because like if we're talking about dictatorship, the word deep state's kind of like a tautology. I mean, a dictatorship by its nature is not transparent, and that word lawless is very key in talking about the deep state, because it's only really a relevant concept when we talk about a system of like, we call this a democracy, but in modern terms, like representative liberal democracy, and what it's supposed to do, where it's supposed to be different from regimes like, let's say North Korea, or even Russia, even though Russia also has a liberal democratic system that is not very liberal or democratic. It's that they have a rule of law in which the rulers can't, they have to go through a process that is, you know, legitimated by popular sovereignty, like elected officials holding them accountable. But if you have this part of the state that can act independently of that and can do things that are deemed illegal by, international standards, and even at times its own stated standards, then you have a conundrum where it's like you have a inverted, I like the word of Sheldon Wool, an inverted totalitarian regime, because it's, democracy kind of inverting into its opposite, as opposed to something that was just always a dictatorship. But yeah, so like to get into that, I think some people still think that JFK, like that is just the idea that he was whacked by people who have connections to intelligence services. That is deemed by some people to be conspiracy. There's
Conspiracy theory.
yeah, like a conspiracy theory that we don't like. There's not enough proof to say. Tell us, why is that not like a conspiracy that is speculative in the way that 9/11 is? Because 9/11, while there's a lot of shady stuff, 9/11 is much more like still inconclusive. Where
Well, everybody agrees 9/11 was a conspiracy. I mean, that is the 9/11 Commission
Yeah,
says that it's
what
a
I mean is,
conspiracy, and they have a
talking about
conspiracy theory.
an inside
Well, what
job.
I think
The
it's
idea that
important, what you're
inside job is a conspiracy theory still.
yes, but I think what you're getting at is a way that the language has been made nonsensical to us. That you're saying that you would be reflecting the common understood meaning of conspiracy theory, which is essentially a theory to explain events that disagrees with the regime's version of said events, is therefore a conspiracy theory. But it really makes no sense at all, because a conspiracy, these words have meanings. Like conspiracy is, one or two or more people secretly plotting and or executing a plan for something nefarious, right? So that's something that we know exists a lot. There's a lot of conspiracies, and then a theory is just any explanation of some phenomenon. So a conspiracy theory is a theory that tries to explain an event with reference to a conspiracy. And in the case of 9/11, the government says 9/11 was the result of a Al-Qaeda conspiracy. That's the government's conspiracy theory of 9/11. Now, in the JFK case, they say the Warren Commission found that there was no conspiracy, that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone nut who assassinated the president from the 6th floor, firing 3 shots, one of which missed, one of which caused 7 wounds in 2 people, and one of which blew off hit the president in the head. But and then that lone nut, because they say it's no conspiracy, was killed by another lone nut who randomly killed the president for no discernible reason either. So, but the funny thing about the JFK case is that the 2 lone nuts both pointed to a conspiracy. Lee Harvey Oswald said, "I didn't shoot anyone. I'm just a patsy," meaning I was just set up. So he was pointing to a conspiracy implicitly, but unmistakably, by saying, "I'm just a patsy." And then Jack Ruby himself said that powerful people put him in the position that he was in, and that if the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court could take him to Washington, D.C., he could explain, what happened. He could tell his story, but he was in danger in Dallas. And so he wanted to be taken to Washington, D.C. And the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court said, "No, we're not going to do that." So the 2 lone nuts both said it was a conspiracy, and then they both die. Lee Harvey Oswald is obviously shot by Jack Ruby. And Jack Ruby he dies in jail of a galloping cancer that came on very quickly. And he had told people that he thought that the people around him were injecting him with cancer. And it turns out that the people who had been doing all those tests on him were MK Ultra connected CIA vetted psychiatrists. And this is now, I think, established definitively by Max Arvo in his new article. So the JFK case is, every aspect of it is absurd of the government story. I mean, Oswald was apparently a false defector to the Soviet Union. That's really the only way to explain his comings and goings as a Marine before he shot the president. And in New Orleans, Oswald is acting as blatantly as an agent provocateur. He's working out of this right-wing FBI guy's office, handing out Fair Play for Cuba Committee flyers. And then he gets discredited on a CIA radio show debating other CIA assets in New Orleans, where it gets exposed that he was like a Soviet person who was sympathetic to, or a Soviet defector, a defector to the Soviet Union, who was sympathetic to communism. And so he discredited the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in that way. But we now know that the U.S. or the CIA was engaging in anti-Fair Play for Cuba Committee actions illegally on domestic soil when Oswald was doing what he was doing. And there's just so many suspicious aspects of this. Like, for one thing, Oswald wrote a letter to someone about a scuffle, a spectacle that he had gotten into with some Cubans. And he sent this letter, but the problem was the letter was sent a week before this famous scuffle that was videotaped, and written about in the paper. It hadn't even happened yet when Oswald wrote that. So, I mean, there's so much evidence about Oswald's past that just makes it pretty clear he was some kind of intelligence asset who likely didn't even understand what he was doing and why he was doing what he was doing. And Jack Ruby is one of the most conspiratorial characters you could imagine. I mean, he was connected to Dallas police corruption. He was probably an informant for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He was involved in two extremely important events in the history of U.S. organized crime in the 20th century. One of them was a murder which led to the Teamsters and the mob getting control of the Teamsters pension fund. That was, and Jack Ruby was in the room when this other figure, labor leader, was murdered, and it led to the Teamster takeover of a huge pension fund. He was also connected to the individuals who killed the head of the wire service, which was a big source of syndicate power because it controlled the gambling activities all across the nation. And Jack Ruby was involved in that. He was involved in different drug cases where he wasn't charged, but probably because he was an informant. I mean, the guy is the most nefarious character. He's connected to people like Johnny Rosselli. He worked at Johnny Rosselli's racetracks, Johnny Rosselli in the 30s. Johnny Rosselli was the guy who helped to set up the CIA Castro mob assassination plots, the CIA mob assassination plots against Castro. And also the same racetrack where Jack Ruby worked out in California for Johnny Rosselli, who was the wire service guy in California, the mobster. That same racetrack also employed, back in the 60s, when Sirhan got injured and he disappeared for weeks and his family didn't know what happened to him because he fell off a horse. And they think that's when he likely was given some sort of MK Ultra programming. I mean, the whole history of these 60s assassinations sounds almost impossible to believe if you're not steeped in this stuff. And there's not many academics that deal with them. A lot of the times it's people like Alex Jones talking about it. So it makes it seem stupid, probably on purpose. That's probably his function. But the amount of evidence pointing to conspiracy in these 60s assassinations, especially the two Kennedy brothers and MLK and Malcolm X, it's enormous, really. And I think the resistance to it is just that the implications are so grave that people just don't want to believe them. If they're regular people, or if you're an official or a media person, that it does not help your career to point to crimes that delegitimize the regime that we live under, because the oligarchy, which owns everything, benefits from this regime. And so it just doesn't behoove you to expose huge crimes of the state, which would delegitimize it.
We don't have a regime. They have, their regime. That's democracy.
They always call other countries a regime, but in political science terms, the regime is just that set of institutions which determine who has control of the state. That's really the definition of regime. But in the U.S., it just means government that we don't like.
Yeah.
In the U.S. media.
Yes, you just outlined a lot of information there. Now, we didn't even, mention JFK, well, and RFK, not RFK Jr. It's the Kennedy brothers, and MK Ultra, and there's MLK Ultra, which we'll get to after. But with JFK, there's tends to be generally like three dominant theories that people hold as to like the assassination and what the motive was. Like, because it's one of those popular things that the streets know. The streets know Kennedy.
Yeah.
It was absolutely a conspiracy to kill him. It wasn't just like a quacks. I think this is at this point just people take one look at like the situation and they say, okay, there's way too much going on here for this not to be some plot. And of course, if one wants to explore this further, aside from Aaron's work, of course, and Peter Dale Scott probably being the most scholarly bunch, like if Aaron did his PhD on this stuff. There's also, of course, the not Roger Stone,
Yeah, I can give you. There's
Oliver Stone.
Oliver Stone's JFK is a very good entry into the whole case because it lays out a lot of the facts of the case, and it was very meticulous about the way it dealt with the facts of the case. It took liberties in terms of dramatizing aspects of the Garrison investigation. It used composite characters to make things a little simpler for people. But when it came to the details of the case, the forensic details and the biographical details of Oswald and so on, it's very accurate, very well done, and very well edited. So that's great. As far as books go, Brothers by David Talbot is a very accessible book. Jim D'Eugenio's book, JFK, The Evidence Today, is good, or his book, Destiny Betrayed. Jim Douglas's JFK and the Unspeakable is a phenomenal book. David Talbot's The Devil's Chessboard. And if you've read those and are interested in the really complex but important angle of organized crime and intelligence agencies and how they're intertwined with the oligarchy of corporate wealth, the overworld of America, the richest people, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK by Peter Dale Scott is really kind of a singular masterpiece in terms of how much amazing material is in there that shows you that the U.S. and the political economy of capitalism, in the 20th century, is so corrupt and intertwined with criminal activity and the imperialist pursuits of the U.S. regime. It's mind-blowing. And then if you read Deep Politics and you understand how corrupt it was back in this golden age, supposedly, of the 50s and 60s, and then you think like, okay, actually now I kind of do understand how something that's this corrupt, and then the corrupt people prevail, and it just gets worse, and it gets worse, and it gets worse, and you get Reagan, and you just get further and further right wing. It's where you have like Genocide Joe versus Donald Trump in this election. I mean, this is so absurd, and yet that's where we are. And the Kennedy assassination points to a kind of systemic corruption of empire and capitalism, imperial capitalism, that will help you to understand why the U.S. is in such a bad way today.
Yeah, definitely. Very well said. Yeah, when it comes to that conflict, people I'm speaking on behalf of people who don't know that much on the subject, but are kind of just positing. Usually there's three ideas that are floated, which is one, CIA killed JFK. That's the one that seems to have the more strong evidence behind it. Then there's the other one, which is the Irish mafia killed JFK. That was popular one.
It's usually the mafia that gets blamed for it, which becomes an Italian caricature eventually. That's actually the last investigation said that it was a probable conspiracy. This was done by Congress, and it ruled that it was a probable conspiracy, and it ruled out the CIA and said that it could have been some people in the mafia and then some Cuban exiles. Those were that was the pool that they limited it to, but it's basically like Italian mafia was ultimately what they tried to say did it, but it was a very strange way to try. There was too much evidence of a conspiracy to say, oh yeah, it was Oswald. And so they kind of settle on some indeterminate mob thing, and then nobody ever reinvestigates it.
And then the third one, which is kind of gaining traction again today, is the Israel theory, the theory that Mossad killed.
That's pretty obscure at this point, though.
Yeah, you said that's not the case. And that's not one I've heard that often, but I heard it being talked about recently. So, I'd like you to maybe go into some detail there as to like why that it doesn't seem plausible for you and why, the CIA one makes more sense. And also in terms of motives, because of course,
Yes.
like connecting the motives here is pretty crucial because,
Right.
yeah.
Well, I think that the CIA did it version is not precisely how I would characterize it, but more like the national security state and the intelligence community, but that actually means more than the CIA. Believe that CIA assets were involved and CIA officers were involved, especially James Angleton, and then people under him like Bill Harvey, David Morales seems to have been involved. Richard Helms probably knew it was going on. Alan Dulles was out of the government, but he may have been orchestrating or managing parts of it. I also believe that the Pentagon likely, the Joint Chiefs of Staff likely greenlighted the assassination and was backstopping it in some way, probably using doomsday network or continuity of government network resources. So there's a system in the US where if there's a nuclear war, there's a communications network and a group of people that can act decisively if there's a decapitation strike and the president can't act. And so they can intervene in politics and sort of take control. I would bet that that was implemented on November 22nd, 1963, and that the people in the continuity government and Joint Chiefs of Staff, they likely used the fact that Kennedy was having these secret back channel talks with Castro and with Khrushchev as a way to make the case that he was some kind of security risk, that he was compromised by the communists or whatever. He had a lot of sexual dalliances with people, and those are sometimes, that's an institution of the CIA and also organized crime. And so they could have had blackmail on him, but not that they could really use by like leaking to the press in a certain way because, the press kind of handled those things differently. But they may have had any sort of rationalization for why they could authorize this and why it would have to be kept extremely secret forever. They likely did something like that. They killed Frank Olson, who was a CIA official who had been working on MK Ultra. They killed him in 1953, probably because he was going to tell the truth about Korean biowarfare, that the U.S. had been using biological weapons and that those captured airmen in Korea were telling the truth. And so that's probably why they killed Frank Olson. But if you understand that they did kill Frank Olson, who was a U.S. official, and then there's a mechanism to be able to do that, then you would have to have the kind of thinking of these people who are kind of lunatics, really. They're sort of fascists, but in a national security bureaucracy. That's really the mentality that they have. And they would have to think, well, what do you do if the president is compromised? And they could come up with all sorts of dire scenarios and then emergency powers they could give themselves. I suspect that something like that happened with Dallas. And as far as the motives go for people, the Kennedy made a speech in the summer before he was killed, a few months, about the need to end the Cold War, essentially, that we should understand the Soviets' position. We should try to appreciate how much they suffered in World War II. We should understand that we breathe the same air and that nuclear war should be unthinkable. And he even wanted to go to into space with the Soviet Union. His last UN speech, as I recall, was about this joint space exploration program with the Soviets that he wanted to undertake. And so the ending the Cold War would result in enormous amounts of profits lost for military industrial complex firms. And you'd have to sort of reorient the American economy towards some kind of civilian production, which means potentially infrastructure, schools. You could actually have the economic effect of militarism, but just by making America great in terms of creating roads, infrastructure, railroads, schools, universities, hospitals, clinics, all sorts of things that you could do to stimulate the economy in a similar way that the military industrial complex does. But that is not what those kind of right-wing oligarchs want. They like the militarism because it's just money that doesn't make money spent, but not money that creates a kind of socialist or democratic counterweight to oligarchy of the corporate rich. So ending the Cold War itself was a huge deal. He also wanted better relations with Sukarno in Indonesia. And unbeknownst to Kennedy or Sukarno, Indonesia, West Papua, a part of which became a part of West of Indonesia officially under Kennedy, because the Dutch had been trying to hold on to it. But the biggest gold mine in human history was in West Papua, and Kennedy and Sukarno weren't even aware of it. But people like Allen Dulles were aware of it, and the Rockefellers and so on, presumably. And so they overthrow Sukarno after Kennedy dies, because Kennedy wanted to have good relations with Indonesia. Under Johnson, they overthrow Sukarno. They murder 500,000, 1 million, 2 million. People don't even really know. They just slaughter all of these ethnic Chinese people and Communist Party members, but they were really just kind of Marxist, rural reformers. And they put in a puppet, and then the corporate America is able to loot the biggest gold mine in human history for decades. They're still doing it today. It's the Freeport-McMoran mine. And also the most productive oil well in Southeast Asia was near the same place. And they began to exploit that in the 1970s, Western oil interests. So that's the issue of third world resources and third world nationalism was another reason why Kennedy had to go. He didn't want to rule. He didn't want the U.S. to be this neo-colonial power. And ending the Cold War would have been a way to help that, because the Cold War was always the excuse for overthrowing every government. They're always saying, "Oh, Mossadegh in Iran he's a communist. He's a communist dupe, and Sukarno's too close to the communists, and Arbenz in Guatemala he's soft on communism. We got to get rid of him."
Yeah,
So that's another reason.
Not even and Castro, who's not a communist at the start. I mean, he explicitly invokes Declaration of Independence, says he's not a communist. Like literally, there's a clip you can even find on YouTube of him saying that. Then, ironically, the anti-communism that's used as an excuse to, basically punish Cuba for fighting for its own freedom and overthrowing its dictator is to, the fact that they use communism as an excuse, ironically pushes them towards the Soviet bloc, which is a part that people tend to forget in history.
Yeah, and that's actually fine, I think, from the CIA's perspective in a sense, because if he had nationalized all of those industries, but didn't, put himself in the communist camp, then it would be hard. Could be a little harder to justify taking all these measures against him and the blockade and everything else. But because he is nominally a communist, I mean, he actually asserts that he's a communist and he becomes clearly allied with the Soviet Union. It gave them an excuse, to go after Cuba and to blockade them. And another aspect of this whole, enterprise of the U.S. and the deep politics of the U.S. is the issue is Israel. I mean, Kennedy did more to confront Israel than any other president in U.S. history. He was insistent on stopping the Israeli nuclear program. And he also wanted to try to solve the Palestinian refugee crisis, the Palestinian crisis. And he just ran into all sort of trouble doing this. But he did cause the resignation of Ben-Gurion, because Ben-Gurion didn't want to take receipt of a letter that Kennedy sent in late 1963. And so, which was talking about the imperative of having these inspections of the Dimona site, which is where the nuclear bomb came from. And David Ben-Gurion resigns rather than accept receipt of this letter. So it's a stalling technique. And then Kennedy dies very shortly afterwards. So people would like to say that it was Israel that did this, but the argument for that is, I don't believe, very good, because you have to explain things that I think require reference to the Pentagon, really, and the military brass and the CIA, itself. The way to understand the Israel angle, I believe, is that Israel was intertwined with the deep state of the U.S. People like Hoover were very sympathetic to right-wing Zionists, and he had backers that were right-wing Zionists. Like, I think Louis Rosenstiel is an infamous one who was a big supporter of Hoover. But additionally, Lansky is this figure Meyer Lansky is this figure in the underworld, and the U.S., he was the person who led the U.S. alliance with organized crime in World War II. They speak to Lansky, and Lansky says, "Hey, get my friend Luciano out of prison and we can really be a business here." And the mythology is more that the National Crime Syndicate is this Italian, Italian mafia thing. But I think that's more of a cover story, really, that they were in charge of the national distribution networks of narcotics and such. but that Lansky and his crew, which is a kind of Yiddish mafia is what they used to call it, but it's a kind of, this is a multi-ethnic syndicate involving like some Italian aspects and some Jewish aspects and different aspects. But when you look at Lansky and these people in Las Vegas who handled a lot of the money laundering, they, unlike Gus Greenbaum is one of them, and Lansky himself, they are close to Israel. Meyer Lansky was one of the main people, and other mobsters like Mickey Cohen. They were some of the main indispensable people for getting all those weapons over to the Zionists to establish Israel in the first place. And they even sabotaged other boats at the docks that would have been taking weapons to the Palestinians. And another person involved in these arms shipments to Israel was Jimmy Hoffa. And there you get into RFK talking about the Teamster corruption all around the country, and the Teamster pension funds helped to build Las Vegas casinos, which were used to launder the money that the Italian mafia would have that made from the drug trade. So it was not only did it allow them to launder all this money, but it gave Mossad, presumably through Lansky, a very valuable map of corruption in the United States. The people who were mobbed up and compromised by organized crime in basically every major city and region in the United States, because Lansky laundered all the money, is what it seems to be the way that it operated. And that's why Robert F. Kennedy wrote The Enemy Within about organized crime, and he went after Hoffa. But after the Kennedy administration, in the 70s, when the House Select Committee is looking at the mafia, they ignore Robert Kennedy's old thesis, which was different than the J. Edgar Hoover and the Federal Bureau of Narcotics idea of like La Cosa Nostra or Italian mafia. Robert Kennedy was saying the Teamsters are kind of central here, and he wanted to get at what was really going on. But then they basically say, forget about that. It's this Italian thing. And you even get like all these Hollywood movies that come out to sort of mythologize that era. And I now think that those are basically propaganda in a sense. They're like cover stories in a way. And it's funny, but in Godfather 2, there's this character who is based on Lansky. I don't remember his name, maybe Hyman Roth or something like that, but I could be wrong about that. But in the Godfather 2, he is at the airport and he's going to flee to Israel because he is under investigation. And then some Italian mafia person comes up and shoots him, right? But that's not what happened to Lansky. Lansky, when he did get it investigated finally under Nixon, he fled to Israel and he stayed there until 1973, when I would guess he feels safe to return, in part because Nixon is embroiled in Watergate and has different concerns rather than going after the syndicate. So Lansky is a key figure there, and I believe that his involvement and the syndicate's involvement in the Kennedy assassination, especially in the personage of Jack Ruby, who is very much connected to those Las Vegas syndicate mobsters, this gave Israel an enormous amount of blackmail leverage over the U.S. And so in 1967, LBJ is in office, and the U.S. allows Israel to just steal the occupied territories, Gaza and the West Bank. They launch a preemptive war against Egypt, and they take over Palestine, which they've been occupying up to the present day. That's the start of this, what we see now. The real start, I guess, is 1948, but like the 1967 war is why Israel has occupied the occupied territories. And that, LBJ was very close to these Teamster and other organized crime figures and Texas oilmen and military industrial complex people. So this is a dark part of our history. And maybe as Zionism seems to be potentially falling apart, this whole project, although we'll see how it goes, I believe that with the weakening of U.S. power, which Israel needs above all else, and the fact that they are the most hated country in the world, I think both of these projects, the U.S. Global Dominance Project and then the Project for Greater Israel, these have been intertwined, unfortunately, but they both may be not long for this world. And if we can manage this without nuclear war, it would be a great thing.
I actually don't really see them as intertwined, because I don't think, if you look at like the foundation of Israel, their biggest supporters who enabled the creation of Israel at the beginning are more actually Britain and the Soviet Union more than the US, of course, helps. But like the most enthusiastic people who want the creation of Israel is the Soviet Union and Britain. And there's it's a kind of a little bit of a dark thing in the history that sometimes you don't want to admit. Like even a lot of leftists actually were pushing for the creation of Israel because the founders of Israel claimed to be Marxist,
Yeah, that was
very ethno-nationalist type of socialism. But like, at the time it seemed, oh, the kibbutz, they're like communist, left wing, and
yeah.
this kind of sympathy for it. America becomes the like dominant partner in crime with Israel. I would say, like, as you said, with that war in the 60s. And even more,
And the 1948 recognition of Israel, which
well,
Harry Truman did after
yeah,
receiving a huge campaign contribution from a wealthy Zionist in America, which probably was instrumental in helping him to upset Thomas Dewey in 1948. So that aspect of it is when America becomes a major guarantor
oh
of
yeah,
Zionism. But it does ramp, but there's still conflicts.
It-
Eisenhower does not does not side with them in the Suez Crisis. Not until
yeah,
LBJ, with Kennedy out of the way, and LBJ, green lights the 67 war and tolerates Israel attacking an American
that's right.
vessel, the USS Liberty, and killing Americans on purpose. And LBJ is like, we're just not going to make a big deal about this. Everybody makes mistakes.
Yeah, they didn't like they literally covered for Israel shooting down an American ship.
Yeah. Strafing it, shooting it, knowing it was American, trying to come back and shooting it more to try to sink it so they could get away with it. I mean, it was really treacherous.
I mean, why did they shoot at it?
This is disputed. Some people say that it was because it was connected to like a signals intelligence sort of surveillance or reconnaissance, and so perhaps they wanted it to be destroyed so that the U.S. could not be aware of the things that Israel was going to be doing, or potentially you shoot it down and then you blame Egypt for it. That would be a very Israeli thing to do. So it's not known exactly why they did it, but I think those are the two main theories as to what their motivation would have been.
Yeah, I point out that prior history just because I do notice sometimes people on the left do this thing where they try to tie like American settler colonialism to Israeli settler colonialism as if they're both inherently bound up with each other, which kind of, I think, in a weird horseshoe theory way, reifies the rights and the whole establishment, American establishment's consensus of being that Israel is our natural ally and that America will always be there for Israel. And what I mean by that is by that horseshoe theory thing is that I don't think it's particularly helpful when trying to make a case against U.S. imperialism to basically say this country, is just inherently tied to America. Whereas I think, no, America does not need to be supporting Israel. In fact, I don't think it's no longer in America's interest, even from that standpoint.
Probably never was.
Probably never was. I mean, you could of course, Biden, he says, if there wasn't Israel, we'd create one. Because in the war on terror, there's
all these guys. Yeah.
in the war on
All
terror,
these
there
people
is
say that.
weird interest. Like when I say not an interest for the American people, but there is like an imperialist interest in supporting Israel. Definitely.
I don't even think that. I think it's killing them. Like what was done
Now it is.
after 9/11, the fact that Israel got its wish, that they basically articulated this insane policy for unipolar empire, right? And it was a super Zionist, Paul Wolfowitz, who did it under George H.W. Bush first with this defense policy guidelines draft report. And I think George H.W. Bush, because he was something of a nationalist, was opposed to this. And he called the neocons the crazies in the basement, in the Pentagon basement. And they leaked that report and it was kind of a scandal. But the result, I believe, George H.W. Bush tries to force the Israelis to enter into negotiations. He does for a Palestinian state. He says he's going to withhold $9 billion, I think is the number, in loan guarantees if Israel did not enter into negotiations for a Palestinian state. And they hated him for this. And there's even articles in I think the Times of Israel where they're saying like, yeah, George Bush lost because he lost the Jewish vote. But that's not really it's not the vote that matters. It's the power of the oligarchy, their media assets, They were probably involved in incentivizing Ross Perot to enter into the race. I would guess that's the case just because of the timing of it and the impact of it.
Hmm.
And also,
Never heard.
incidentally, I found out something to strengthen that thesis, which I was already suspecting because of a number of factors. But I found out that there was one U.S. Oil company operating in Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, basically stealing Iraqi Kurdish oil and instead of sending it to Baghdad, sending it through Turkey where it would go to Israel. And the company that was doing that it was owned by Ross Perot Jr. So it was a very insider kind of deal for Israeli oil, getting oil to Israel and stealing it from Iraq, basically. And the guy behind it was Ross Perot, which to me lends some support to the thesis that Ross Perot Sr. was part of a Zionist effort to defeat George H.W. Bush, because George H.W. Bush wanted he saw a two-state solution as being better for the U.S. and better for U.S. interests, rather than alienating the whole region because you're so obsessed with Greater Israel. Now, his son, George W. Bush, according to a former oil executive and one of the top people in the Iraq oil ministry after the Iraq war, he is close to other people in the oil industry who are friendly with the Bush family. And according to him, the reason W. Bush became so pro-Israel and did all these things like the Iraq war that Bibi Netanyahu wanted was because he believed his father did not get a second term because he confronted Israel. And so he wasn't going to repeat that mistake. So he lets the neocons basically run his foreign policy. And it means all these wars in the Middle East with Israel as the obvious beneficiary. And he does get reelected. So he was logical in that way, but the problem was he's known as a disastrous failure of a president because of the response to 9/11.
Look, regardless of whether, those specific details are confirmable or not, I think this broader point you're making is important because I think the left has a bit of a Stockholm syndrome and thinking that the only party capable of going against Israel is the Democrats. I don't know why they believe this because, there's been times where even the Republicans have thought Israel was going too far. I want to remind people who told Israel to pull out of Lebanon during the invasion of Lebanon. But it's Reagan,
Yeah.
there's been times where the American Republicans have thought Israel is going too far. Of course, Nixon, has these interviews where he says the Israel lobby is a real concern
Yeah.
and that they're getting way too powerful. And, early on, it was the Democrats who were actually bigger Israel supporters, partially because
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
this is the kind of thing, especially not leftists everywhere, but especially Western leftists, especially in the US, had this kind of naivete about Israel being this sort of socialist state. I mean, this is a kind of lost history we all want to erase out of our memory, but this is how sometimes they this.
There's the Western left, the U.S. left has always been mostly useless. What are the victories of the Western left, really, the U.S. left? Over time.
Well, I wouldn't go that general. There's anti-Vietnam, there's civil rights, there's also, of course, there's the left in the early 1900s. There's different aspects of there's good things and there's horrible things.
Those are liberal reformers, though, generally. Liberal reformers.
Well,
There's not.
I don't think
the U.S. isn't.
I don't think it's a liberal
Go ahead.
reform thing because I think who was the people who backed Israel? It was the Soviet Union. They were originally
The Soviets were, and the Soviets also have a considerable Jewish population. Their support wasn't it was diplomatic. I don't know how much material support they gave early on, but there was an effort of the Zionists to kind of disguise what they were really about.
Well, yes,
And I think that was a weird, really,
at the start.
and because the Ben-Gurion is basically a fascist. People think oh, it's Bibi, and then this Greater Israel thing happened after 1967. But if you look at these guys and how David Ben-Gurion was really not, he saw any attempt to try to solve the Palestinian crisis as a huge threat to Israel. These guys wanted Greater Israel. The commanding heights of Zionism and people like Ben-Gurion were really not much different from Netanyahu. Ben-Gurion's personal bodyguard was a guy named Yashua Cohen. And Yashua Cohen was a terrorist, murderer who assassinated a great Swedish statesman, like Folke Bernadotte, I think was the name, who was in Palestine talking about the partition and how it was, working, basically advocating for something that would be a little more fair for the Palestinians. And the Stern gang and Joshua Cohen, they assassinate this guy. And David Ben-Gurion makes him his personal bodyguard. This terrorist assassin is David Ben-Gurion's personal bodyguard. And when at a UN function of some kind, Dag Hammarskjöld is actually seated next to this person. And Dag Hammarskjöld is a Swede himself. And it was probably, and somebody asks him if he knew who it was or something to that effect. This was relayed to me by Ola Tenander, who's a Swedish peace research academic, at PRIO, the original Peace Research Institute, the one that Johan Galtung funded. And Ola was telling me about this. I wasn't even aware of the story, but Ben-Gurion was about like Netanyahu. The stuff about the kibbutz and a socialist utopia.
Well, no, but
this is all bullshit.
No, this is what I'm saying. So, I say this not.
Yeah, I'm just agreeing with you there. They had this mystique of,
but they were socialist for Jews only. That's what I mean. You're right to actually point out the fascistic aspect, because the only thing that does separate Israel from a kind of fascist state is the fact that it has like a liberal rule of law. We can debate even whether it even has that anymore, but it has it's not a total state. It's not like a totalitarian state, but in terms of ideologically speaking, I mean, you have like a socialistic collectivism, welfare programs, but like ethno-nationalism. I mean, it has a lot in.
I mean, it has all the hallmarks of fascism, even if it has elections. I mean, you can have elections because the population is fascist. So it's like a fascist election. You know what I mean? Like this with the plan, it's like a tiny minority that in Israel that opposes Trump's plan to forcibly evict the Palestinians.
Yeah, yes. Right now. But I wouldn't say that the Israeli population are all inherently fascist, because I mean,
I didn't say all, but most of them are today.
Well, yes, but this is why I think Netanyahu relies on Hamas, and the hardliners rely on Hamas to create this fear that they can mobilize, because just before October 7th, they were like, Israel was having a civil war, and there was like, there was an effort, right, like against to overrule the Supreme Court. And that was these big protests. And what was the Supreme Court trying to prevent? New settlements. Like they were trying to slow shit down. So, I mean, that kind of, there's a lot of the protesters were defending the court against Netanyahu. Like this is a complicated sort of event. But like now that's kind of all been forgotten because of the attack. You can just mobilize all the Israelis to the far right again. And, anyway, that history though I say that because there's a kind of ineffective way some people protest the Israeli occupation, I think, which is they like go burn the American flag, and they'll be like, American and Israel, they're just always inherently like together, and, down with America, down with Israel. I'm like, no, there's going to be no end to this unless like America, stops arming Israel. Like that's just. And
with America's position as the global hegemon, the global sovereign that it has aspired to, that is crumbling. And that is I think that is a part of why we're seeing what we're seeing now. I think it's not a coincidence that that NATO is crumbling, and Europe there's this center of gravity that is just shifting, and Europe, the logical thing for Europe to do would be to pull out of NATO and just ally with the Russians and
that's not what's happening at all though.
Well, but the AfD is about to win in Germany, and the main thing is that they want to have relations with Russia because they need to have Russian resources. German industry is being destroyed. I mean, Romania, the U.S. just had to basically get them to cancel elections and make up some ridiculous made up bullshit about how the Russians were intervening in their economy or in their political process. And there was no evidence for it at all. France has a government. I mean, they're preventing the election from being carried out.
France said it's willing to go to war against Russia with Britain without the U.S. if necessary.
I mean, the public isn't for that. The government in France should not even be the government. They basically ignored the last election because they want to keep this Western puppet, this U.S. puppet in there. So, and the economies of these countries are really in a bad way.
I don't want to say, that's the thing. I'll be careful with the U.S. puppet. I think France is an imperialist power in its own right. I mean, that everyone knows that. that's obvious. That part's obvious. But France is like independent from the US and it always has been in a way that it has its own kind of deep state. Like it's not part of the
They did,
France is
yeah,
not part of
they
the Five
did
Eyes.
more.
Not part of the Five Eyes. Like they call it the Five.
No, but
England.
they have some freedom of movement, and at some points they've been antagonistic to the U.S., especially de Gaulle.
Yes.
The U.S. tried to kill de Gaulle using Gladio people, the Gladio assets, essentially, like the OAS, right? Isn't that what it was called? The Secret Army Organization. And they didn't succeed in killing de Gaulle. And so de Gaulle turned his own security services on these guys and, killed these networks of CIA-backed fascists, essentially, that were there to keep France on the side of the Americans. And for a while, France wasn't in NATO. And the U.S., the operation in Rwanda that we think of as the Rwandan genocide seems to have been a U.S. regime change operation, because the U.S. backed Kagame before his forces shot down the president's plane, which sparked these mass killings. So I don't think we understand really what happened there. But by and large, France has been more in the U.S. orbit. And when they have tried to exert an independent foreign policy, like with the Iraq War and such, it hasn't gone well for them. So for the last few decades, they've been, in the U.S. orbit, whether you would, and I don't recall them standing up to the U.S. in any substantial way, really, since the Iraq War. And that didn't work out for them anyway. They couldn't do anything about it.
What I mean is, I think, the Europe, I want to say Europe. When I say Europe, I really mean the EU elites, and France and England have more of a, they are more worried about Russia than the United States is. I actually think United States does not care about Ukraine. Like they basically, do that as a way a cost-effective way for them to weaken their biggest military rival, Russia. And
economic rival, like a geopolitical rival. I mean,
sure.
I think it could be even be related to Syria. I mean, the Russians messed up U.S. plans in Syria.
Yeah.
And that's around the time that they launched the Maidan coup. So I think that may have been related to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but also Europe has, when I'm saying Europe has it's hard to talk about like Europe generally, but France and England, like Macron and Starmer, have both independently said that U.S. in or not, they're prepared against Russia. I say
they say that, but they know they're lying.
I mean, I hope nothing breaks out.
They couldn't field an army. Neither one of them could field an army against Russia unless Russia invaded them, which is not going to happen.
I mean, I don't know about that.
We'll see if they enter into Ukraine. We'll see but I don't think France or Britain is going to end up doing that. And they would just be destroyed by nuclear, conventionally or with nuclear weapons. They would be crushed by Russia.
I do also want to say, though, with the weakening of the U.S., the thing also at play here is that Israel gets about, I believe it was, I don't know if it was 40 or 50% exactly, but almost half of its arms from outside of the U.S. also. And that includes one of its biggest backers being France. France is a huge backer of Israel militarily. And you also have economic partnerships with Israel that haven't been changed despite, these condemnations. Like China still keeps its deals with with Israel economically. It doesn't back them militarily. But, in Turkey, despite all what it says, all of what Erdogan yaps about, they've been, still basically giving Israel oil indirectly. So,
I mean, not indirectly, they've been facilitating the smuggling and stealing of oil from places like, Kurdistan and Syria, goes through Turkey and then to Israel. Erdogan is a very sinister, duplicitous fellow.
Yeah. So where I do see the kind of aspect of Israel, it's more complicated than just the U.S. But the thing where I think I was saying before, which I think we're largely in agreement of, is that America's relationship with Israel has changed and has had, ups and downs, and it can change. I really do believe it can change. And I found, especially this time around, the biggest shift I've seen with Gaza is when, more than in my lifetime I've ever seen, people on the right actually opposing Israel. Has been very uncommon before that, especially war on terror era. So that kind of argument of Israel, not actually backing Israel, not being in America's interest, I like that more than America and Israel being like inherently tied to each other.
Well,
Has
let me
like,
explain
really,
why they're tied to each other. Okay.
yeah, go
So
on.
people would say, okay, are you saying that Israel controls America or that America controls Israel? Well, I think both of those are kind of silly formulations because we're talking about a kind of Western political regime that involves deep states or deep political forces, which are really oligarchic forces or anti-democratic forces. And in the U.S. oligarchy has a considerable Zionist contingent. And some of them are Christian Zionists who like the militarism or they like some sort of crazy Christian worldview, or for whatever reason, they either through business or nutty, eschatology, they support Israel. But there's also, and I think more historically important, there are American Jewish Zionists who have supported Israel in various ways to the hilt. So, for example, the birthright tours, like if you're an American Jew, you can get a full expenses paid trip to Israel. And you might even have sex with an IDF girl and lose your virginity over there because they have all these creepy practices, right? It's like birthright. And what's the birthright? It's like basically Palestinian land is your birthright. And the main funders of these are two mobbed up Zionist oligarch families, the Bronfmans, who are the Seagrams fortune, all the bootlegging with Meyer Lansky in Prohibition era and beyond. And the other one are the Adelsons, which are, they own Las Vegas casinos and such, which is traditionally a vehicle for money laundering, at least in the Lansky era, and probably still today are involved in all sorts of, mobbed up things, I would guess. I mean, Las Vegas casino, organized crime. I mean, it's like, this is a pretty gangster milieu there. Or people like Henry Crown or the Annenberg family. And these are, who was connected also to the mob with the wider service. And these people have done as much as they could to influence American politics. And, if my thesis about the control of the drug trade being by Lansky in the 50s and 60s, even though the Italian mafia was the sort of front organization for that, then they're likely involved in organized crime networks, along with the CIA. I mean, the CIA and Mossad, I think, had partnerships with Lansky and organized crime networks, and they believed it was all justified by, in the U.S. side, they believed whatever you did was justified because of anti-communism. But the result is you've got this oligarchy that has partly been fueled by organized crime connected to Zionism, and then that money gets invested into, quote, legitimate enterprises. And so you have these billionaires in the U.S. who, people like Chaim Saban or whatever. He's a huge Democratic funder, one of the biggest ones in the past. I don't know how much he does nowadays. But these are oligarchs who spend a lot of money on political contributions. Even on a smaller level, like every independent school and university is terrified, independent private schools, for rich kids. Like they are terrified of donors, pro-Israel Zionist donors, taking away their money if they do anything against Israel. So you've really got a case of oligarchic politics moving U.S. foreign policy. And they have created a situation where the blueprint for U.S. hegemony over the Middle East is let's empower Israel to the hilt and let them go around and, bomb, attack any country that might want to nationalize its resources or anything like that. But other people had different ideas about this. Eisenhower, JFK, I believe even Nixon, H.W. Bush, probably Carter, Ronald Reagan. I mean, Ronald Reagan, the last thing he does as president is he recognizes the PLO. And because previously he and the U.S. had been saying like, well, they can't negotiate because they are terrorists and we're not going to recognize them. And then finally they do recognize them. And this really upsets Israel. Probably, I would guess, having looked at these issues a bit, that the reason Iran-Contra becomes this big scandal that weakens Reagan, it's likely related to his shift in Israel policy. Because if you look back at Iran-Contra, the U.S. is always running drugs to paramilitaries and doing gangster business all around the world. Why does Congress become suddenly so interested in this sort of practice and going after the CIA and such? So I suspect that elements within the Israeli intelligence that were working with these operations, like the trafficking of, the arms to Iran and the hostage deals, because it involved Israeli intelligence actors like Ari bin Minash, for example. It was a Lebanese paper that leaked one of the major stories that sparked Iran-Contra. And I mean, Peter Dale Scott, who actually avoids the subject of Israel, he told me himself that he surmises that was an Israeli leak, basically, to spark the Iran-Contra thing. So I think that the ways that and Epstein, for example, Epstein seems to be pretty clearly an Israeli asset. I mean, Ghislaine Maxwell, her father, Robert Maxwell, was an Israeli super spy.
Okay, so what is the evidence of that? Because I've thought that it's highly plausible, but some people outright dismiss the idea of Epstein working for the Mossad, because it's still there's the father relation. But I mean, is there any strong evidence of Epstein himself actually working for the Mossad?
As far as direct evidence of somebody for Mossad saying that, there Ari bin Minash, who is a Israeli spy himself, he surmised, and he was involved in Iran-Contra and the Promise software theft and the October surprise scandal of 1981. Ari bin Minash said that Epstein was probably a Israeli sexual blackmail operation, essentially, probably outsourced by the CIA to the Mossad so that they would carry these operations out. And then the U.S. the CIA wouldn't be officially doing this, and it would be there'd be a little degree of insulation for that. But the fact that he was with Ghislaine Maxwell and that Robert Maxwell was this Israeli spy, I mean, that's about the most damning, it's okay. What was Maxwell doing all of this time with figures all the figures of that era in the deep state that he was working with? There's this great book, Robert Maxwell, Israel's Super Spy, and it goes into the corruption that surrounded Maxwell and his milieu and just his whole intelligence role. And he gets murdered in a strange way around 1991. At the same time, other people like Senator John Tower are dying, people that have been involved in these. He dies in a plane crash, but who were involved in some of these intrigues involving Israel, including the Promise software, the sale of an Israeli, basically bugged or trapdoor Promise software to the Los Alamos nuclear laboratory. And that was a big scandal. And John Tower, through Robert Maxwell, was involved with this. Robert Maxwell, the Mossad spy. And Robert Maxwell, he lost a lot of his family in the Holocaust. You kind of understand why he would be, an ultra-Zionist. But, his daughter carries on that sort of intelligence role with Epstein. And it's just, it's not that you're not going to find proof for it. But they said that when they were trying to confirm Acosta for a cabinet post under Trump, they asked him about the sweetheart deal he gave to Epstein, which allowed him to avoid jail time and such. And Acosta said, well, I was told that he belonged to intelligence, that he was too big a fish and that we couldn't go after him. So we know he belonged to intelligence because, a high-ranking U.S. official admitted that. So that is he CIA or is he Mossad? And Mossad is, I think, Mossad, who has being subcontracted by the CIA to carry out these kind of operations. That to me seems the most likely explanation.
You know that book called One Nation Under Blackmail? Is that legit? That book?
I haven't read it yet. Webb, it's very long. I find her writing to be kind of convoluted. And I also find it dubious that she doesn't really have a thesis that I can explain so much. She so avoids having any critique of political economy, which means she has, I guess, some people on the left and a lot of right-wing followers that follow her. Okay, so that said as a caveat, I would guess that a lot of the things in there, because I've read some of her work in snippets, has valuable, information on the networks of these people. Whether all of the connections she makes are actually, valid, I'm not really sure. And she's not a historical materialist or a social scientist. And so I have issues with her methodology, but I think the gist of it, of there being an enormous amount of blackmail and skullduggery involving organized crime intertwined with Zionism, is likely on the mark. It's just, she's not in the vein of like Peter Dale Scott or myself or Ola Tannand or other academics, Michael Parisi, who would have an interest in historical materialist perspectives to explain the deep politics of the U.S. She fixates kind of on the mob, and she doesn't really see it as a natural and indispensable part of capitalism, which I would say that it is. I think the mob is probably the most pure. They're the most pure capitalists really of all, because that's how the capitalist state emerged in Europe, was basically protection rackets, mafia protection rackets. That's the origin of the capitalist state. If you read Charles Tilly, this is how it was created.
I don't really want to nitpick that, just because I kind of agree with the sentiment. But I also think that there's also capital wants to, and the role of the capitalist state is also to create like quote unquote fair rules to allow for more capital accumulation. And like I view
Well, let's say rules. Let's say that to create rules, whether they're fair or not.
I view the Reaganists, like for example, Rudy Giuliani and what he did in New York, which, he did to clean out the mafia. Like he's more than any other mayor, like at that time, and more than Democrats, that's for sure. Part of why they did that is because like they saw the mob as an obstacle to like gentrifying all these areas. They wanted to like make New York way more like open for investment and able for like, companies to start up and invest. And they saw the mob and also crime, like that mob crime perpetuated by the mafia is like an obstacle to that, that's kind of why they cleaned them out. It's kind of the merchant rightist thinking, I call it, because like the merchant right is about new money, whereas the Democrats sometimes, even if it's not consciously, represent old money a lot of the time. Although there's a bit of that on both sides. But I want to.
Yeah, the Democrats were more tied to Israel in the early post-World War II era.
Yeah.
It's Truman that recognizes Israel, whereas other more people were especially more concerned. People like James Forrestal, a more Republican side, more WASPy side, had a similar view to Eisenhower and Standard Oil crowd. They didn't like, for example, I learned this from Charlotte Dennett. John McCloy, who was a Rockefeller man, they were against doing anything to intervene in the Holocaust, likely because the Standard Oil crowd, Rockefeller and so on, saw Israel as being a sort of countervailing force against their plans for the oil in the region and the relations they wanted to have to the Saudis and other people to make sure that American oil companies were going to be dominant in the Middle East. And so some of these people were opposed to Israel for that reason, that they saw this as another element that was not really compatible with American interests, especially the Eastern establishment, Wall Street, Standard Oil, Council on Foreign Relations sort of people, that they were against it. But the Democrats, in part because they're close to organized labor, which is mobbed up and pro-Israel. I mean, the Teamsters are very pro-Israel. If you go back and look at it, the Yitzhak Rabin Center is like run by the Teamsters and Teamster officials. It's a very weird thing. Jimmy Hoffa, his lobbyist, Irving Davidson, who was involved in a lot of Kennedy assassination intrigues and so on, a very shady character. But there's an FBI file that says the reason that he also became a lobbyist for Jimmy Hoffa was because the Israelis told him to. So the Democrats, because of their connection to Teamsters and organized crime and so on, these political machines, and also because of Zionist oligarchs as well, they've been the party that was closer to Israel in the early decades after World War II.
Yeah. So before we end off by me asking you your speculations on what might come out of these declassified documents that Trump signed, which are supposed to come in, one of them, the Kennedy, being 15 days after January 30th, and then the MLK ones on 45 days. Before that, since we're on the subject of Israel, what literally just happened a day before we're having this conversation is Trump announced that that Israel is going to be taken over. That Gaza is going to be taken over with the help of the United States for Israel. Of course, they said that it's to rebuild Gaza, and
no, but without the Palestinians. He said they've got to go.
Yeah, without the Palestinians, and they're gonna flee where? exactly? Egypt said that they don't really want to take in all those Palestinians.
They said no. They said we're not going to.
Yeah, and so did Jordan too. Jordan is
Yep.
so what is going to happen here is I don't know what do you think's like happening with this? Because some people thought like peace was going to come out of like the ceasefire and Trump might actually, you know, stop this. I don't know.
It might still.
I think Trump's very compromised, but like I don't know. What do you think about
The possibilities are wide open. There have been, I believe, statements by Trump to the effect that the U.S. military may go over there and take care of it, which I think would be potentially disastrous. I don't know that. I mean, it's a disaster because you're talking about genocide. The Palestinians don't want to leave Palestine because they're Palestinians. They shouldn't have to. And the question, and they were, even with all the slaughter that we've seen in Gaza, the genocide, my understanding is they've killed like 10% of the population. So for all they've damaged their own legitimacy and really become the pariahs of the world, they didn't do much they weren't successful in destroying the Gazans. And now everyone in the world is focused on what happens over there. So if they don't have a place to put them and they just have to slaughter them, I don't think that the U.S. military, I'm hoping that the rank and file is not going to accept this and that there would be pushback and that maybe even Europe, it would accelerate Europe's decoupling from the U.S. because even though they've been such slavish and kind of pathetic devotees of Zionism, during this whole process, I also feel that some of the state responses, the government responses of different countries in Europe has in part to do with the fact that these policies may not be as popular with the public. And so they have to try anything to keep them anti-Israeli sentiment from becoming like a consensus, perhaps. So maybe that Trump will run into resistance and they won't be able to pull this off. I believe that what has happened since October 7 is that the U.S. position of the world is weakening. U.S. global dominance is clearly weakening, and it doesn't seem to be reversible. There's an impending defeat in NATO in Ukraine. I mean, NATO is going to lose in Ukraine. There's no way that the Ukraine can win quote unquote.
That's not their goal.
No, but it doesn't matter. Like the point is,
their goal is to sacrifice.
They don't have any chance.
So that
Ukraine is going to be unable to field an army in the not too distant future. People are going to desert. There's going to be more fraggings of people. There's already major desertions. I don't think that war is going to last long. And the fallout of that should be the end of NATO because NATO serves no purpose really at all.
Though, actually. No,
look, Germany is close to electing an anti-NATO party as things stand now. I mean, that is the linchpin of the whole strategy is if Germany goes, and they look set to do that, whether that will happen or something else.
I will give you one thing. Trump, more than any other president so far, is doing the most to accelerate the decline of dependence on American hegemony, like for sure. Like just with his tariffs and all that, with his hostility to all of America's allies. I mean, it's insane. Like it's almost as if he's backed by China.
Well,
I think the biggest, I don't see Russia as an ascending power, but I do see China as an ascending power, and by far the biggest winner in all this is China.
Yeah. I mean, Russia is not this juggernaut that is going to change history because it's such a huge economic engine for technological progress and infrastructure development.
The government didn't suck.
What's that? Well, the situation that Putin found himself in was a new establishment of Russia that was a mobbed up Western-backed oligarchy.
Yeah, sure.
And he had to deal with that. And so he did jailed Khodorkovsky.
His first 5 years.
This gangster. Russia is in
his first 5 years.
Russia is in a better position today than they have been at any point since the end of the Soviet Union. Their economy, their manufacturing is higher. A problem that they have now is
pretty low
inflation. Bar. Well, I mean, look, look at the trajectory of Russia over Putin's over the Putin era, and you could even include the Medvedev years in there, and it's a steady improvement of life expectancy and economic indicators and so on. And the war in Ukraine has not hurt them economically. They now have issues of inflation as a problem, but the problem is their population is low such that they have a
Because
hard
they're
time.
leaving the country. That's the Russia, the biggest thing they suffer from is brain drain because a lot of their talent leaves. And why do they leave?
Well,
The war
mean,
is a big part of that.
their technology, whatever brain drain they have, I mean, they have hypersonic missiles that the U.S. doesn't have. They have military technology that is way ahead of what the U.S. has.
Well, for what? It hasn't stopped really the U.S. from continually basically doing anything but like a direct war with Russia. But like they've intervened, they've done like acts of aggression that would have been unthinkable in the Cold War, the U.S. against Russia. And they've gone away with it, which means that I think the intelligence agencies in the United States know something about the weakness of
But
Russia that we probably don't.
they haven't gotten
How do
away
they
with
get
it,
away-
though. I mean, they didn't get away with it. They attempted to make Ukraine a NATO country, and Russia said, no, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. And they attempted to negotiate. Finally, they're saying, if we have to discuss this now, this is imperative. These are red lines. You can't keep shelling the Donbass. And the U.S. ignored them, and then Russia invaded. They tried to negotiate an end to that war after Russia demonstrated that they weren't going to allow Ukraine to be turned into a NATO, beachhead. And the U.S. scuttled those negotiations, and so the war continued. But the war could never have been. The Ukraine was doomed always, because if the U.S. intervenes with enough power to turn the tide on, the Russia would just escalate, and then eventually it would go nuclear. So that's why they cannot win in Ukraine. And they have wasted enormous amounts of money and weaponry. The European stocks of weaponry and munitions, I understand, that are very low because the U.S. has forced them to send all this materiel to the Ukrainians. The German economy is in shambles to the point that they're about to elect Alternative for Deutschland, which was unthinkable until this.
Europe declined more faster than America is. My view,
but that is not good for America, because this is understanding.
U.S. dollar,
the understanding, right? But the understanding in Europe is, and I would have to guess Ukraine at some point, they're going to realize that the author of their misery is Uncle Sam, and that Uncle Sam is not their friend. He hasn't been their friend forever. NATO is really a dictatorship over Europe, and if any European leader goes against it, they'll murder them. Olof Palme in Sweden was more of an internationalist, wanted better relations with the Soviet Union. They just shoot him in the head. I think it was the head, or maybe it was the chest. But either way, some sort of gladio person killed him. And that was after the U.S. had staged all these fake submarine incidents so that they could say the Soviets were threatening Sweden. And that helped to turn Swedish public opinion back to being anti-Soviet. So that's the kind of friend NATO is. The Aldo Moro murder in the 1970s, he was going to negotiate a compromise that would have led the left into a coalition government. And Henry Kissinger told him, if you proceed with this, you're going to be killed. He did. And then he was murdered by these sock puppets of NATO gladio type things, the Red Guards, supposedly communists, but they're the toys of the intelligence agencies and such. Alfred Herrhausen was blown up in Germany because he wanted similar things, to basically socialize infrastructure and more connection between reunited Germany and Russia. And he was blown up in a very sophisticated operation in an armored car. It was in a big caravan, basically, right? Convoy. And they managed to blow him up with a very sophisticated explosive in the late 80s. So NATO is just, the guy that was shot recently, what was it, Slovenia? The president was shot, Fico? Was it Slovenia or Slovakia? I get them confused, but that's probably a similar kind of a thing. I mean, NATO is basically the American deep state in Europe, and it's the sovereign power there. They were, I know from talking to Ola Tenander, the Swedish peace research studies expert, he talked to Swedish generals. And going back decades, Sweden had understandings with the U.S. military, even though they weren't in NATO, that they would have a stay behind, like a gladio unit that the U.S. would control. And essentially, they had to do whatever the U.S. generals told the Swedish generals to do, and that the rule was nothing on paper. So basically, there are these understandings between the U.S. national security state, U.S. military brass and officials that Sweden, who's not even in NATO, has to do whatever the US says ultimately. And that's the way Europe has functioned, with a few hiccups like de Gaulle for a while. He tangled with these elements and had some independence. But, by and large, NATO is the sovereign of Europe. I mean, which is really, the US has run Western imperialism, and they've overthrown governments in Australia, for example, that people don't know of. We didn't like a leader that they had, go Whitlam. And so they overthrew him. That involved like the Nugan Bank and other actors.
Wasn't that
the British Crown was even involved?
Yeah, and the British Crown's the one who told him to step down.
Well, they didn't tell him. He just dissolved Parliament by some act that nobody even knew was legal, and it was the same day.
That's Canada, that they can do that too. Unfortunately, that's constitutional monarchy. The monarchy is symbolic, but if they wanted to, they can totally dissolve the democratic government.
And the guy in question had been an OS or CIA asset, but also, as I understand
monarch?
it. No, the guy that was the agent of the Crown in Washington,
Governor General?
Australia. Yeah, the Governor General. I think that may have been the title.
Yeah, because the Governor General represents the monarch.
This big listing base, Pine Gap, and other things that were inimical to U.S. national security interests. And so Whitlam had to go. But the bigger point is that they'll overthrow Western governments too. I think there's even a couple of English cases where this happened. I can't even, this is a specialty of mine, and I can't even keep track of all the governments the U.S. has overthrown. But the bigger issue is that, what I was getting at earlier is why October 7 happens and the genocide happens. And my point is that with U.S. hegemony in decline and trade with Russia being an economic integration with Russia being the obvious solution to a lot of the problems posed by the American decline and Europe's problems, and also China's rise relative to the U.S., this put Israel in a difficult position because they have wanted this greater Israel pipe dream forever. They never declared their borders specifically for this reason. They always wanted all of it, as much of the Palestine as they could take. So they would never admit what their borders were. They would sabotage the peace process as much as they could at every opportunity. But they're dependent upon the U.S. And with the U.S. weakening, I think it set off panic. And so they thought October 7 will be our pretext to do what we need to do. And that's why the response has been so insane. But it's only accelerating. I believe it's accelerating the decline of the U.S., even though their drastic actions are taken in part as a response to the decline of U.S. power, in the sense that we had better act
That part
quickly.
I disagree completely with, but that's...
Do you think that Israel is not totally dependent on the U.S. to carry out all of its genocidal operations?
In large
That's
part,
the first
yes.
part.
In
And
large
so
part,
what does the decline of U.S.
It has other
what does
allies
the
who want... So this is what I'll say. America lets Israel get away with as much heinous shit that it does, more than other powers do. However, there's most of the powers that exist, if not all of the powers that exist, arguably, when I say powers, like I'm talking Russia, China included, they have an interest in having Israel exist. And part of why they prefer a two-state solution is more of a question of peace, not because they're anti-Israel. Like an example, China, let's remember, China sees the spread of radical Islam as a threat. That's why they have their surveillance of the Uyghur community. They have their own concerns with Islamic
But
terror.
then those are Israel too. I mean, Israel's cheering these Uyghur terrorists who just took over Syria.
I'm not making a morality argument, but
they understand, right? But I'm saying China understands that their Uyghur issue, the Xinjiang terror networks, are a Western phenomenon, and Israel is a major player in that whole drama, which is why Israel...
It's simple, because even Russia, not too long ago, until this kind of conflict over Ukraine, Russia was totally on board with the war on terror because they had the Chechen Islamic terrorism problem. They were on board with the war on terror. They were trying to...
They didn't understand right away that those were U.S. sock puppets, but they eventually figured that out.
The Chechens?
The Chechens were Al-Qaeda backed by the U.S. If you watch Oliver Stone's interviews with Putin, he talks about that. He said that to George Bush himself. But I have to go, actually, because I have an appointment. I have to leave.
Okay. The last thing, though, I just do want to get the last thing. What do you think might come out of the files? Because, given Trump's close relationship with Israel, I mean, what really are they gonna leak? Are they gonna leak the full truth? Because like,
No, yeah.
can they be?
They won't. They won't. They supposedly there are documents that will show the CIA had much more relations with Oswald. And some people have seen that and talked to people like Tucker Carlson and Jeff Morley and spoken about those things. So there may be a little bit of good information there. But by and large, I think the rest of the documents of any definitive account will not be forthcoming, I would guess.
What
I
about
hope
the
I'm wrong.
What about the MLK files?
I would be surprised. Anything that comes positive about that's a positive development in terms of helping us understand, I'll be pleasantly surprised about.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimists, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.